Every muscle in my body ached as I hunched over the keyboard, the fluorescent lights of Moretti Industries casting harsh shadows across the endless stack of paperwork that had become my existence. The metallic taste of blood lingered on my tongue from where I'd bitten it to keep from crying out earlier, when Evan's latest outburst had left me with a bruised rib that protested with each breath I took. The familiar weight of concealer felt heavy beneath my eyes, carefully applied to hide the purple shadows that had nothing to do with lack of sleep and everything to do with the man I'd foolishly thought loved me. The scent of expensive coffee and leather permeated the 23rd floor of the sleek Manhattan high-rise, a stark contrast to the cheap instant coffee I could barely afford in my cramped studio apartment. My fingers trembled slightly as I typed, partly from exhaustion and partly from the constant state of hypervigilance that had become my norm. Every sound in the corridor made me jump. Every voice that carried through the glass walls of the executive offices sent my pulse racing. Not because I feared my boss. Joseph Moretti was demanding but fair. But because fear had become my default setting. I pressed my palm against my ribs, where the pain flared with each shallow breath. Evan had been particularly violent last night after I'd mentioned working late again. He didn't like it when I stayed at the office past 6, claimed I was trying to attract attention from other men. The irony wasn't lost on me. I went out of my way to remain invisible, to blend into the beige walls and polished marble floors like a ghost, haunting the corridors of corporate power. The elevator dinged softly, and I heard the familiar sound of expensive Italian leather shoes against marble. Mr. Moretti always arrived at exactly 8:30. His routine as precise as everything else about him. I'd been his secretary for 8 months now, and in that time, I'd learned to read his moods by the weight of his footsteps. Today they sounded heavier than usual, purposeful in a way that made my stomach clench with anxiety. "Good morning, Julia." His voice was smooth, cultured, with just a hint of an accent that spoke of old money and older traditions. I looked up from my computer screen, forcing what I hoped was a professional smile, despite the way my lip pulled at the small cut Evan's ring had left there. "Good morning, Mr. Moretti. Your 9 o'clock appointment with the Carlyle Group has been moved to 10:30 at their request. The contracts you asked for are on your desk, and the quarterly reports from the Chicago office arrived this morning." My voice sounded steadier than I felt, a small victory in a life that had become a series of small defeats. He paused beside my desk, and I could smell his cologne, something expensive and masculine that made me think of safety, though I couldn't explain why. When I dared to glance up, his dark eyes were studying me with an intensity that made my breath catch. There was something different about his expression today, a sharpness that went beyond his usual professional scrutiny. "You look tired," he said quietly, and there was something in his tone that made my chest tight. Not criticism, but concern. I wasn't used to concern. "I'm fine, sir. Just a busy week." The lie came easily now, as practiced as the concealer routine. I'd become an expert at fine, at managing expectations, at making myself small enough that no one would look too closely. But Joseph Moretti was looking closely. His gaze lingered on my face for a moment longer than was professionally appropriate. And I saw something flicker in his expression, a darkness that had nothing to do with displeasure and everything to do with recognition. He'd built an empire on reading people, on seeing the things they tried to hide. I should have known that my carefully constructed facade wouldn't fool him forever. "I'll be in meetings most of the day," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Hold my calls unless it's urgent." I nodded, already turning back to my computer screen, but I could feel his presence lingering. When I finally heard his office door close with a soft click, I allowed myself to slump slightly in my chair, my ribs protesting the movement. The morning stretched ahead of me like a minefield. Documents to type, calls to field, the constant effort of pretending that my life wasn't slowly disintegrating around me. By lunch, the pain in my side had intensified to the point where I could barely concentrate. I'd skipped breakfast again. Not from any eating disorder, but because buying groceries meant less money for the increasing demands Evan made on my paycheck. He'd started taking my debit card more frequently, claiming he needed it for job interviews, though I suspected the money was going toward the bottles that seemed to multiply in our apartment like a plague. I was reaching for a file in the bottom drawer when the movement sent a sharp spike of agony through my torso. The gasp that escaped my lips was involuntary, and I pressed my hand to my side, closing my eyes against the wave of dizziness that followed. Julia. I hadn't heard him approach, but when I opened my eyes, Mr. Moretti was standing beside my desk, his expression darker than I'd ever seen it. There was something dangerous in his stillness, a predatory quality that should have frightened me but somehow didn't. "I'm fine," I said automatically, trying to straighten in my chair. Just moved too quickly. His eyes dropped to where my hand was pressed against my ribs, and I saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "Stand up." It wasn't a request. The authority in his tone was absolute, the kind of command that brooked no argument. I rose slowly, fighting another wave of dizziness, and his gaze tracked every minute movement, every wince I couldn't quite suppress. "Lift your shirt." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Sir, Now." There was no room for argument in that single syllable, no space for the protest that died on my lips. With shaking hands, I raised the hem of my blouse just enough to reveal the angry purple-black bruise that stretched across my ribs like an abstract painting done in pain. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Joseph's face transform, watched something cold and terrible settle in his features. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and for a moment, I caught a glimpse of the man beneath the polished businessman, someone capable of violence that would make Evan's petty cruelties look like child's play. "Who did this to you?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than any shout. I lowered my shirt with shaking hands, unable to meet his eyes. "I fell, down the stairs. I'm clumsy." "Don't." The single word cut through my explanation like a blade. "Don't insult my intelligence with lies." The tears I'd been holding back for weeks suddenly threatened to spill over. In 8 months of working for him, Joseph had never been anything but professional. But there was something in his voice now that spoke of protection, of a man who had just seen something that offended him on a fundamental level. "It's not your concern, Mr. Moretti," I managed, wrapping my arms around myself as if I could hold the pieces of my dignity together through sheer force of will. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to catch the faint scent of his cologne mingled with something more primal. Anger, barely leashed and entirely focused on my behalf. "You're wrong," he said quietly. "You are very much my concern." Before I could process what he meant, what the implications of that statement might be, his phone rang. The shrill sound cut through the tension like a knife, and I reached for it automatically, grateful for the interruption. "Moretti Industries, Mr. Moretti's office." "Is he there?" The voice was gruff, impatient. "This is Detective Martinez. We need to speak with him about the Giannetti investigation." I looked up at Mr. Moretti, whose expression had shifted into something unreadable. He held out his hand for the phone, and I passed it to him, trying not to think about how his fingers brushed mine, or the way that simple contact sent warmth shooting up my arm. "Detective?" he said smoothly, but I caught the slight tension in his shoulders. "What can I do for you?" As he spoke, I tried to focus on the computer screen, on anything other than the conversation taking place mere feet from my desk. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in those few minutes, that the careful balance I'd maintained for months was about to crumble entirely. When he hung up, Mr. Moretti's attention returned to me with laser focus. "I have to go out for a few hours. When I get back, we're going to have a conversation." It wasn't a suggestion, and I nodded mutely, already dreading whatever that conversation might entail. as he gathered his coat and briefcase. I caught him looking at me one more time, and there was something in his expression that made my heart race, for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. "Julia," he said from the doorway, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable promise. "This isn't over." After he left, I sat alone in the quiet office, my hand unconsciously drifting to my bruised ribs. For the first time in months, I felt something other than resignation settling in my chest. It might have been hope, or it might have been terror. In my world, they'd become indistinguishable. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of nervous energy and mounting dread. Every time the elevator chimed, my heart jumped, thinking Mr. Moretti had returned. Every phone call made me wonder if it was Evan, checking up on me with that particular brand of paranoia that had intensified over the past few weeks. The bruise on my ribs throbbed in rhythm with my pulse, a constant reminder of the previous night's violence and the conversation that awaited me. At exactly 5:30, I began shutting down my computer and organizing my desk for the next day, the familiar routine providing a small measure of comfort. Most of the other administrative staff had already left, their voices and laughter fading as they headed to happy hours and dinner dates, normal lives that seemed as foreign to me as life on another planet. I envied them their freedom, their ability to look forward to the evening instead of dreading what waited at home. I was gathering my purse when I heard the distinctive sound of Mr. Moretti's footsteps in the corridor. My movement stilled, and I felt that familiar tension coil in my stomach. Through the glass walls of his office, I could see him approaching, his expression unreadable but purposeful. He wasn't alone. 2 men in expensive suits flanked him, their posture suggesting they were more than simple business associates. "Julia." His voice carried that same quiet authority from earlier, and I straightened automatically. "Please come into my office." It wasn't a request, and I followed him on unsteady legs, hyper-aware of the 2 men who remained in the outer office, but whose presence felt like a physical weight. Mr. Moretti closed the door behind us with a soft click that somehow felt final, and I found myself alone with him in the space that had always felt so safe before. His office was a study in understated power, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, dark wood furniture that spoke of old money, and artwork that I suspected was worth more than I made in a year. But tonight, it felt different. There was an energy in the room that made my skin prickle with awareness, a sense that whatever conversation we were about to have would change everything. "Sit," he said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs positioned in front of his massive desk. I perched on the edge of the seat, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, and watched as he moved around to lean against the front of his desk. The position put him closer to me than was strictly professional, close enough that I could see the way his jaw tightened as he studied my face. "Tell me about him," he said without preamble. "The man who put his hands on you." The directness of the question sent a flush of shame through me, hot and acidic. "Mr. Moretti, I appreciate your concern, but this really isn't his name." The words cut through my deflection like a blade, and there was something in his tone that spoke of barely controlled violence. "Give me his name." I stared at him, taking in the way his hands gripped the edge of his desk, the rigid set of his shoulders beneath his expensive suit. There was nothing soft about Joseph Moretti in that moment, nothing that suggested the civilized businessman who signed my paychecks. This was someone else entirely, someone dangerous in ways I was only beginning to understand. "Evan," I whispered, the name feeling like a betrayal on my lips. "Evan Mitchell." He nodded once, a sharp movement that somehow felt like a verdict being passed. "How long?" 6 months. The words came out small and broken, and I hated myself for the weakness they revealed. It wasn't always like this. He was different in the beginning. They always are. His voice carried a weight of knowledge that made me look at him more closely. There was something in his expression that spoke of experience with violence, with the kinds of men who hurt women. "Where does he work?" The questions kept coming, each one delivered with the same quiet intensity, and I found myself answering despite every instinct that screamed at me to stay silent. He pulled details from me with surgical precision. Evan's workplace, his schedule, his habits, the patterns of his violence. With each revelation, I watched something harden in Mr. Moretti's features, something cold and implacable settling over him like armor. "Why haven't you left?" The question was gentler than the others, but it hit me like a physical blow. Where would I go? The words tumbled out before I could stop them. Months of trapped desperation finally finding voice. He knows where I work, where my mother lives. He's threatened to find me if I leave, and I believe him. I stopped, unable to voice the rest of it. The way Evan's jealousy had grown into something monstrous. The way he'd started talking about making sure no other man would ever want me. Mr. Moretti was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was deadly soft. "He's what, Julia?" I met his eyes, seeing something there that should have terrified me, but instead made me feel safer than I had in months. "He's sick, in ways that go beyond just hitting me. He talks about permanent solutions, making sure I can never leave him." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. I watched as Mr. Moretti straightened, his movements predatory and precise, and I caught a glimpse of the man he must have been before the expensive suits and corporate respectability. Someone who understood violence intimately, who could wield it with the same precision he brought to his business dealings. "That's not going to happen," he said quietly, and there was such absolute certainty in his voice that I almost believed him. "Not while you're under my protection." The words should have confused me, should have raised questions about why my boss was involving himself in my personal life. Instead, they sent a wave of relief through me so powerful it was almost painful. For the first time in months, someone was offering to stand between me and the growing threat that had become my life. "I can't ask you to." "You're not asking." He moved then, coming around the desk to crouch in front of my chair, bringing himself to my eye level. The gesture was unexpectedly gentle, but there was nothing soft about the intensity in his dark eyes. "This isn't about what you're asking for. This is about what I'm choosing to give." His proximity was overwhelming. The scent of his cologne, the way his suit pulled across his broad shoulders, the calluses on his hands that spoke of a past very different from his current corporate image. There was something about Joseph Moretti that called to a part of me I'd forgotten existed, the part that had once believed in protection and safety, and men who kept their promises. "Why?" The question slipped out before I could stop it, and I saw something flicker across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition. "Because some things shouldn't be tolerated," he said simply, "and because you deserve better than to live in fear." Before I could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. One of the men from the outer office entered without waiting for permission, his expression respectful but urgent. "Sir, we have the information you requested." Mr. Moretti rose smoothly, his demeanor shifting back into that of the businessman I knew. But I caught the way his hands flexed at his sides, the subtle tension that suggested barely leashed action. "Evan Mitchell," the man continued, consulting a small notepad. "Works the night shift at Morrison's warehouse on the west side. Gets off at 7 a.m. Usually stops at the Riverside Diner for coffee before heading home to the apartment on Lexington Street." I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized they'd been watching him, gathering intelligence with the kind of efficiency that spoke of resources far beyond what any legitimate businessman should possess. The pieces of a puzzle I hadn't known I was solving clicked into place. The deference his employees showed him, the way certain clients spoke to him with a mixture of respect and fear, the fact that Detective Martinez had called him about an investigation. "Thank you, Marco." Mr. Moretti's voice was steady, but I caught the undercurrent of something darker. "That will be all for now." After the man left, the silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken implications. I stared at Mr. Moretti, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time, understanding that the man who signed my paychecks was capable of things that existed far outside the boundaries of corporate law. "You're not just a businessman," I said quietly, and it wasn't a question. He met my gaze steadily, and there was no attempt at denial in his expression. "No, I'm not. Should I be afraid of you?" The question hung in the air between us, and I watched as something shifted in his features, something almost vulnerable appearing beneath the controlled exterior. "I would never hurt you," he said, and there was such quiet sincerity in his voice that I believed him without question. But I can't say the same about others who threaten what's mine. The possessive note in his voice should have alarmed me, should have sent me running toward the door. Instead, it sent warmth spreading through my chest, a feeling I hadn't experienced in so long. I'd almost forgotten what it was like to feel wanted, rather than simply tolerated. "I should go home," I said, though the words felt hollow. Home wasn't home anymore. It was a battlefield where I was always losing. "No." The word was gentle, but absolute. "You should go to your apartment, pack what you need, and then you should disappear for a while." "I can't just disappear. I have work, responsibilities." "You have vacation days," he interrupted smoothly. "Consider this an extended break, with full pay, of course." The careful way he phrased it told me this wasn't really a choice, that the concern in his voice was backed by the kind of authority that didn't accept arguments. Part of me wanted to protest, to insist on handling my own problems, but a larger part was simply grateful that someone was finally offering me a way out of the endless cycle of fear and violence. Where would I go? Something that might have been satisfaction flickered across his features. "Leave that to me." The hotel room Mr. Moretti had arranged for me was nothing like what I'd expected. Instead of some seedy motel on the outskirts of town, I found myself in a suite at the Meridian, one of Manhattan's most exclusive hotels. The marble bathroom was larger than my entire apartment, and the view from the floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the glittering expanse of Central Park spread out below, like a tapestry of lights and shadows. I stood at those windows now, watching the city move beneath me, while my mind raced with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. It had been 18 hours since Mr. Moretti's men had escorted me to pack a single bag. 18 hours since I'd sent a text to Evan, claiming I was visiting my sick aunt in Philadelphia. The lie came easily. I'd become an expert at deception over the past 6 months, but the guilt that usually accompanied such untruths was noticeably absent. The knock on the door made me jump, despite expecting it. Mr. Moretti had said he would come by to check on me, to discuss next steps, though I suspected the conversation would be far more complicated than those simple words implied. I opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, looking as impeccably dressed as always, but somehow different in this intimate setting. "May I come in?" His voice carried that same careful politeness, but there was something in his eyes that suggested the formality was for my benefit, rather than any real uncertainty about my answer. I stepped aside, hyper-aware of the way he moved into the space, how his presence seemed to fill the elegant room with a kind of controlled energy. He was carrying a manila envelope and a small paper bag that smelled deliciously of fresh pastries, a gesture that was unexpectedly thoughtful given the circumstances. "You need to eat," he said, setting the bag on the marble-topped table near the window. "You're too thin." The observation was delivered matter-of-factly, without judgment, but it highlighted how closely he'd been watching me. The realization should have made me uncomfortable, but instead, it filled me with a warmth I didn't want to examine too closely. When was the last time someone had noticed that I was losing weight, that the stress and fear had been eating away at me physically as well as emotionally? "Thank you," I said softly, accepting the coffee he offered me. The cup was from that little Italian place down the street from the office, The one where a single cappuccino cost more than I usually spent on lunch. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. He settled into the chair across from me, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. We need to talk, Julia, about what happened last night. My hand stilled on the coffee cup. What about last night? Evan Mitchell. He opened the manila envelope and withdrew a single photograph, sliding it across the table toward me. He won't be bothering you anymore. The image was grainy, clearly taken from a security camera, but I recognized Evan's profile immediately. He was getting into his car outside the warehouse where he worked, the timestamp showing it was taken at 7:23 a.m., just hours after I'd disappeared. But there was something wrong with the picture, something that made my stomach clench with a mixture of relief and terror. Where is he? I asked, though part of me already knew I didn't want the answer. Gone. Mr. Moretti's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the weather rather than a man's disappearance. Permanently. The word hung between us, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to face. I stared at the photograph, at Evan's familiar face, and waited for the horror to hit me. Instead, what I felt was an overwhelming sense of relief so powerful it made me dizzy. The constant fear that had become my companion, the dread that colored every moment of every day, all of it simply vanished, leaving behind a lightness I'd forgotten was possible. You killed him. It wasn't a question, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I protected you. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze intense. There's a difference. Is there? I met his eyes, seeing no remorse there, no guilt or uncertainty, just the calm satisfaction of a problem solved, a threat eliminated. In the eyes of the law. His mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. The law would have required you to file charges, to testify, to relive every moment of his abuse in front of strangers. The law would have given him bail, opportunities to find you, to make good on his threats. The law would have failed you, Julia, just like it fails most women in your situation. The brutal honesty of his words hit me like a physical blow, partly because I recognized the truth in them. How many times had I considered calling the police, only to remember stories of women who'd tried that route? How many restraining orders were just pieces of paper to men like Evan, men who saw violence as their right and possession as love? What if you're wrong? I asked, though the question felt hollow. What if he could have changed? Men like him don't change. His voice carried a weight of experience that made me shiver. They escalate. They find new ways to hurt, new threats to make. He would have killed you eventually, Julia. I simply saved us both the time. The casual way he said it, the certainty in his tone, should have terrified me. Instead, I found myself thinking about the fear that had become my constant companion, the way I'd started avoiding mirrors because I didn't want to see what Evan's violence was turning me into. For the first time in months, I could take a full breath without wincing, could sit without calculating the nearest exit. Who are you? The question came out softer than I'd intended, carrying more vulnerability than I'd meant to show. Really? He was quiet for a long moment, and I watched something shift in his expression, as if he were weighing how much truth I could handle. When he spoke, his voice carried a formality that suggested he was sharing information he rarely disclosed. My family has been in the import business for 3 generations, he said carefully. We specialize in ensuring that valuable items reach their intended destinations safely, regardless of the obstacles that might arise. The euphemisms were elegant, but I understood what he wasn't saying. The Moretti family wasn't just in the import business. They were in the control business, the power business, the kind of enterprise that operated in the spaces between legal and illegal, where most people feared to tread. And I work for you. Another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. You work for my legitimate business interests, he corrected gently. Moretti Industries is exactly what it appears to be. A successful import company with offices in 6 countries and a reputation for discretion and efficiency. But it's not all you do. No, he admitted. It's not all I do. The silence stretched between us, and I found myself studying his face, looking for signs of the violence I knew he was capable of. But all I saw was the same careful attention he'd always shown me, the quiet consideration that had made working for him such a relief after the chaos that had become my personal life. "Are you afraid of me now?" he asked quietly, and there was something almost vulnerable in the question. I considered it seriously, examining my feelings with the same care I'd once used to navigate Evan's moods. The logical part of my mind insisted I should be terrified, that I should be planning my escape from this elegant room and the dangerous man who'd arranged my stay here. But the emotional truth was more complicated. "No," I said finally, surprised by my own honesty. "I should be, but I'm not." "Why?" The question was simple, but the answer was anything but. I thought about the way he'd looked at my bruises, the controlled fury in his voice when he demanded Evan's name. I thought about the careful way he'd arranged my escape, the concern in his voice when he'd insisted I needed to eat. "Because you could have hurt me months ago if that was your intention," I said slowly, working through the realization as I spoke. "Because you've been nothing but respectful, even when you had every opportunity to take advantage. Because when you found out someone was hurting me, your first instinct was to protect me, not to use my vulnerability for your own benefit." Something shifted in his expression, a warmth that transformed his features from merely handsome to something approaching beautiful. It was the first time I'd seen him without the careful mask of professional distance, and the effect was startling. "You're remarkable," he said softly, and there was such sincerity in his voice that it made my chest tight. "Most people in your situation would be looking for the nearest exit. Most people in my situation don't have anywhere to go." The words came out more bitter than I'd intended, carrying months of trapped desperation. "Most people in my situation don't have someone powerful enough to make the monsters disappear. Is that what you think I am?" His voice was carefully neutral, but I caught something else underneath. Hope, perhaps, or the need for reassurance. Someone powerful enough to keep the monsters away? I met his gaze, seeing past the expensive suit and cultured voice to the man beneath. There was darkness there, certainly, the capacity for violence that I'd witnessed firsthand. But there was also protection, the kind of strength that could be wielded as a shield rather than a weapon. "I think you're someone who decides what he wants and then makes it happen," I said carefully. "The question is, what you want from me." The smile that crossed his features was slow and predatory, but somehow it didn't frighten me. Instead, it sent heat spiraling through my chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the way he was looking at me, as if I were something precious rather than broken. "I want you safe," he said simply. "Everything else is negotiable." 3 days passed in the luxury of the Meridian suite, 3 days of room service meals I didn't have to cook and sleep that wasn't interrupted by the sound of Evan's key in the lock. I found myself sleeping through the night, for the first time in months, waking naturally instead of to the sound of angry voices or the crash of bottles against walls. The absence of fear was almost disorienting, like learning to walk again after an injury I hadn't realized was so debilitating. Mr. Moretti visited each evening, bringing news from the outside world and carefully neutral updates about the search for Evan Mitchell. The police had classified him as a missing person, but there was little urgency in their investigation. Men like Evan disappeared all the time in a city like New York, and without evidence of foul play, his case would likely fade into the background of more pressing concerns. "The lease on your apartment expires at the end of the month," he said during his Thursday evening visit, settling into the chair across from me with the casual ease of someone who belonged in elegant surroundings. I took the liberty of having my people pack your belongings. I looked up from the book I'd been pretending to read, a thriller whose violence seemed tame compared to my current reality. Where will you put them? That depends on you. He leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes intent. I have a proposition. The word sent a flutter of something through my chest. Anticipation, perhaps, or the recognition that whatever he was about to offer would change everything irrevocably. I set the book aside and gave him my full attention, hyper-aware of the way the lamplight cast shadows across his sharp features. I'm listening. I need someone I can trust in my personal life, he said carefully, his voice carrying the weight of a practiced negotiation. Someone to manage my household, handle my private correspondence, ensure that my home runs smoothly. The position would require absolute discretion and complete loyalty. The words were chosen with legal precision, but I heard what he wasn't saying. He wasn't offering me a job. He was offering me a place in his world, a position that would put me under his protection permanently. The realization should have frightened me, but instead it filled me with a relief so profound it was almost painful. What would that involve exactly? I asked, though I suspected the details were less important than the underlying offer of safety. You would live in my penthouse, he said, watching my face carefully for any sign of distress. You would have your own wing, complete privacy when you wanted it. Your official title would be personal assistant, but your actual responsibilities would be whatever you're comfortable with. The careful way he phrased it told me he understood the vulnerability of my situation, the fact that I might not be ready for the kind of intimacy his protection implied. It was a consideration I hadn't expected from a man capable of making people disappear, and it made something warm unfurl in my chest. And in exchange? In exchange, you would be under my protection. No one would touch you, threaten you, or cause you pain without answering to me. His voice carried an edge of steel that reminded me exactly how dangerous he could be when protecting what he considered his. You would be safe, Julia. Completely safe. The promise hung between us, simple and absolute. I thought about my cramped apartment with its broken lock, about the job that barely paid enough to cover rent, about the constant fear that had become my normal. Then I thought about the luxury of the past 3 days, the peace of sleeping without nightmares, the way Mr. Moretti looked at me as if I were something valuable rather than disposable. What if I want to leave? The question came out smaller than I'd intended, carrying the weight of every bad decision I'd made in the past year. Then you leave. His answer was immediate, unequivocal. With a generous severance package, and my assurance that you'll never be bothered by anyone from my world again. The sincerity in his voice was startling. Men like Evan made promises that turned into chains, but there was something different about the way Mr. Moretti spoke, a quality that suggested his word was his bond in ways that transcended legal contracts. Why me? I asked, though part of me was afraid of the answer. You could have anyone. Someone with better qualifications, more experience. Because I've spent 8 months watching you handle pressure with grace, he said, his voice soft but certain. Because you're intelligent enough to see past the surface of things, loyal enough to be trusted with sensitive information, and strong enough to survive what should have broken you. Because when I look at you, I see someone worth protecting. The words hit me like a physical touch, warm and startling in their honesty. I'd spent so long being told I was worthless, that I was lucky anyone would want me, that hearing myself described as valuable felt like stepping into sunlight after months in darkness. And because, he continued, his voice dropping to something more intimate, I find myself caring about your well-being in ways that go beyond professional interest. The admission hung between us, loaded with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to explore. There was something in his eyes that spoke of desire, carefully held in check, of a want that was tempered by respect for my circumstances and the trauma I was still processing. "I need time to think," I said, though even as the words left my lips, I knew what my answer would be. The alternative was returning to a life of fear and poverty, of looking over my shoulder and flinching at every unexpected sound. Compared to that, accepting Joseph Moretti's protection seemed less like a choice and more like salvation. "Of course." He rose smoothly, reaching into his jacket to withdraw a black credit card that he placed on the table between us. "Take all the time you need. In the meantime, this will cover anything you require." I stared at the card, understanding that it represented more than just purchasing power. It was a demonstration of trust, a gesture that said he was willing to invest in me before I'd even agreed to his terms. The faith implicit in that offering was both humbling and terrifying. "Mr. Moretti." "Joseph," he corrected gently. "I think we're past formalities, don't you?" The use of his first name felt like crossing a threshold, acknowledging that whatever relationship we were building existed outside the boundaries of employer and employee. When I looked up at him, I saw something in his expression that made my breath catch. A heat that was carefully controlled but unmistakably present. "Joseph," I repeated, testing the name on my lips. "What happens if I say yes?" "Then tomorrow, we go to my penthouse and you see what your new life could look like." He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at me with an intensity that made my pulse race. "And Julia, I hope very much that you say yes." After he left, I sat alone in the elegant suite, turning the credit card over in my hands and thinking about the choice I was facing. In the space of a week, my entire world had shifted on its axis. The man I'd feared was gone, erased as completely as if he'd never existed. The job I'd clung to for survival had transformed into something that resembled a fairy tale. And the boss I'd thought I understood had revealed himself to be someone far more complex and dangerous than I'd ever imagined. I thought about my mother, alone in her assisted living facility, with only my sporadic visits to break the monotony. With Joseph's resources, I could ensure she received the best care available, could visit her without worrying about the cost of travel or time away from work. I thought about the constant ache of hunger I'd grown accustomed to, the way I'd learned to make a single meal stretch across 2 days. In Joseph's world, such concerns would be meaningless, but mostly I thought about safety. Real, absolute safety, the kind I'd almost forgotten existed. No more checking locks twice before bed, no more avoiding eye contact with strangers on the subway, no more carefully concealing bruises and pretending that everything was fine. The promise of such peace was almost too good to believe. When I finally went to bed that night, I dreamed of marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows, of strong hands that offered protection instead of pain, of dark eyes that looked at me as if I were something precious. For the first time in longer than I could remember, my dreams were filled with hope instead of fear. The next morning, I called the number on Joseph's business card and spoke the words that would change everything. "I accept your offer." His response was immediate, warm with satisfaction, and something deeper that sent heat spiraling through my chest. "I'll pick you up at noon. Wear something comfortable. We have a lot to discuss." As I prepared for the day that would mark the beginning of my new life, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror and was startled by what I saw. The hollow-cheeked, hollow-eyed woman who had looked back at me for months was gone, replaced by someone who looked almost hopeful. The bruises had faded to yellow shadows, barely visible beneath the concealer I no longer needed to apply with trembling hands. I was still damaged, still healing from wounds that went deeper than the physical ones Evan had inflicted. But for the first time in longer than I could remember, I looked like someone who might have a future worth looking forward to. When Joseph arrived precisely at noon, dressed in a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and carrying himself with the quiet confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed. I was ready. Ready to step into his world. Ready to accept his protection. Ready to see what kind of life was possible when someone powerful decided you were worth protecting. "Are you ready?" he asked, offering me his arm with old-fashioned gallantry. I took it, feeling the solid strength beneath the expensive fabric, and smiled. "I'm ready." Joseph's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building in the Upper East Side, a space that redefined my understanding of luxury and power. The elevator opened directly into a foyer lined with marble that seemed to glow in the afternoon light streaming through massive windows. Art that I recognized from museum catalogs adorned the walls, and the air carried the subtle scent of expensive flowers and something else. The indefinable aroma of wealth so old and established it had become its own atmosphere. "Welcome home," Joseph said quietly, and the words sent a shiver of something through me that I didn't want to examine too closely. He guided me through rooms that felt more like galleries than living spaces. A formal dining room with a table that could seat 20. A library filled with first editions and leather-bound volumes in multiple languages. A sitting room where every piece of furniture looked like it belonged in a museum. But it was when we reached the wing he'd designated as mine that I truly understood the scope of what he was offering. My quarters consisted of a bedroom larger than my former apartment, complete with a walk-in closet that had already been filled with clothes in my exact size. The attached bathroom featured a soaking tub carved from a single piece of marble and fixtures that gleamed like precious metals. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Central Park, and French doors opened onto a private terrace overlooking the city. "How did you know my sizes?" I asked, running my fingers over a silk blouse that probably cost more than I'd made in a month at my old job. "I make it my business to know everything about the people I care about," he said simply. And there was something in his tone that suggested the admission was more significant than it appeared. "Do you like it?" Seemed inadequate for what I was feeling. The space was beautiful beyond description, but more than that, it felt safe. There were locks on the doors that only I controlled, security systems that would alert us to any intrusion, and beyond all that, the protection of a man whose power I was only beginning to understand. "It's perfect," I said, and meant it. "But I don't understand why you're doing all this." "Don't you?" He moved closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne and see the gold flecks in his dark eyes. "Julia, I've been watching you for 8 months. Watching you arrive early and stay late. Watching you handle impossible deadlines with grace. Watching you hide pain that should have been unbearable." His voice dropped to something more intimate, and I felt heat beginning to build in places that had been cold for too long. "I've been watching you and thinking about what it would be like to take that pain away. To give you everything you deserve instead of everything you've been forced to accept." The words hit me like a physical touch, and I realized that what I was seeing in his expression wasn't just protective instinct or even simple desire. It was something deeper, something that spoke of genuine care masked as business arrangement. "Joseph, I know this is complicated," he continued, reaching out to brush a strand of hair from my face with fingers that trembled slightly. "I know you're still healing, still processing what happened. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give." "Then what are you asking for?" "Time," he said simply. "Time for you to heal. Time for you to see that not all men are like him. Time for you to understand that you deserve to be cherished instead of hurt." The honesty in his voice was devastating, and I found myself leaning into his touch without conscious thought. It had been so long since someone had touched me with gentleness, since contact had meant comfort instead of pain, that the simple brush of his fingers against my skin sent warmth shooting through my entire body. What if I'm too damaged? The question slipped out before I could stop it, carrying months of fear and self-doubt. What if what he did to me broke something that can't be fixed? The flash of anger that crossed Joseph's features was swift and deadly, but I realized it wasn't directed at me. "He didn't break you," he said fiercely. "He hurt you, terrorized you, tried to make you smaller than you are. But you're still here, still fighting, still strong enough to walk away from everything familiar because you knew you deserved better. That's not broken, Julia. That's courage." The words hit me like absolution, washing away months of shame and self-recrimination. For the first time since Evan's abuse had begun, I felt like something other than a victim, like a survivor, like someone who had endured and emerged with her core intact. "I care about you," Joseph continued, his voice soft but certain. "More than is probably wise, more than is certainly professional. I want to protect you, yes, but I also want to know you. I want to learn what makes you laugh, what you dream about, what you want from a life that's finally your own to live." The confession hung between us, vulnerable and honest in a way that took my breath away. I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation I'd learned to recognize, the subtle pressure that had been Evan's specialty. But all I saw was sincerity, patience, and a heat that was carefully controlled, but unmistakably real. "I don't know how to do this," I admitted, gesturing between us to encompass the complexity of what he was offering. "I don't know how to trust someone with power over me, how to believe that protection doesn't come with a price." "Then let me show you," he said, taking my hands in his with infinite gentleness. "Let me prove that there's a difference between strength that protects and strength that destroys. Let me demonstrate that caring for someone means cherishing their choices, not eliminating them." I looked down at our joined hands, noting the way his dwarfed mine, the calluses that spoke of a past involving more than boardroom negotiations, the careful way he held me as if I were something precious. When I met his eyes again, I saw something there that made my heart race. Not fear, but anticipation. "What would that look like?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Dinners together when you want company, space when you need solitude, conversations about books and art and everything that interests you. Time to heal, time to rediscover who you are when you're not afraid." His thumbs traced gentle circles across my knuckles, sending warmth spiraling up my arms. "And when you're ready, if you're ever ready, something more." The promise in those words made my breath catch, but there was no pressure in his voice, no expectation beyond what I was willing to give. It was an offer made without ultimatums, a future sketched in possibilities rather than demands. "The people who work for you," I said, thinking of the men who had gathered information about Evan with such efficiency, "they know what happened to him." "They know that a problem was solved," Joseph said carefully. "They don't ask questions about methods, and they don't discuss business outside these walls. And if someone else threatens me, if there are consequences to what you did—" His expression shifted, becoming something almost predatory. "Then they'll learn why it was a mistake to involve themselves in my affairs." The quiet menace in his voice should have frightened me, but instead, it sent a thrill of something through me that I didn't want to analyze too closely. There was safety in Joseph's strength, security in his willingness to use violence to protect what he cared about. "I have one condition," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "Name it." Complete honesty between us. No lies, no omissions, no protecting me from truths you think I can't handle. I met his gaze steadily, letting him see the resolve in my expression. "I've lived with deception and manipulation. If we're going to do this, I need to know that what you tell me is real." Something that looked like respect flickered across his features. "Agreed. Complete honesty, even when the truth is uncomfortable." "Then yes," I said, the words coming out stronger than I'd expected. Yes to time. Yes to healing. Yes to seeing what this could become. The smile that spread across his face transformed his entire appearance, softening the sharp edges of his features and revealing something boyish beneath the sophisticated exterior. When he leaned down to press a gentle kiss to my forehead, I felt something inside me that had been frozen for months finally begin to thaw. "Welcome to your new life, Julia," he murmured against my skin. "I promise you won't regret it." 2 months passed in what felt like a dream of luxury and careful courtship. Joseph was true to his word in every way that mattered. I had complete freedom within the penthouse, access to resources I'd never imagined, and most importantly, the kind of safety that allowed me to sleep through the night without fear. He was patient with my healing, respectful of my boundaries, and gradually, almost imperceptibly, I began to remember what it felt like to be cherished, rather than merely tolerated. We fell into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Breakfast together when our schedules allowed, conversations about everything from literature to politics to the complexities of running a business empire that straddled the line between legal and otherwise. He introduced me to his world, slowly, carefully, always giving me the option to retreat if the reality of his power became overwhelming. It was during one of these conversations, over dinner in the penthouse's elegant dining room, that the carefully constructed piece of our arrangement faced its first real test. "There's something you need to know," Joseph said, setting down his wine glass with unusual deliberation. "Something that might change how you feel about staying here." The seriousness in his tone made my stomach clench with anxiety, but I'd learned to trust his promise of honesty, even when the truth was difficult. "Tell me." "Viktor Kozlov." The name carried weight, menace, and I saw something dark flicker across Joseph's features. He was Evan's supplier, the man who provided him with the drugs that made his violence worse. When Evan disappeared, Viktor lost a significant source of income. I felt the blood drain from my face as the implications became clear. "He knows what happened. He suspects," Joseph corrected carefully, "and he's decided that you represent an opportunity to recoup his losses." The words hit me like ice water, bringing back the familiar taste of fear that I'd almost forgotten. "What kind of opportunity?" "He believes that someone who matters to me would be worth a considerable ransom." Joseph's voice was deadly quiet, but I could see the fury building beneath his controlled exterior. "He's made inquiries about your schedule, your security arrangements, your vulnerabilities." I set down my fork with shaking hands, the elegant meal suddenly tasting like ash. "So I'm a target now, because of my association with you." "Yes." He didn't try to soften the truth, and I was grateful for his honesty, even as it terrified me. "But Julia, you need to understand something. This isn't your fault, and it's not something you have to face alone." "What are my options?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "You could leave," he said quietly. "I could arrange for you to disappear completely. New identity, new location, enough money to start over anywhere in the world. Viktor would have no way to find you, and you'd be free to build whatever life you wanted." The offer was generous beyond measure, but I caught the carefully controlled pain in his voice, the way his hands tightened almost imperceptibly on his wine glass. The thought of leaving him, of walking away from the safety and care I'd found in his world, sent a spike of panic through me that had nothing to do with external threats. "And the other option? You stay." His eyes met mine, dark and intense. "You let me protect you the way I should have protected you from the beginning. You trust that my resources, my people, my willingness to do whatever is necessary will be enough to keep you safe. And Viktor?" The smile that crossed Joseph's features was cold and predatory. "Viktor becomes a cautionary tale about the consequences of threatening what belongs to me." The possessive note in his voice should have alarmed me, should have reminded me of Evan's obsessive jealousy. But there was something fundamentally different about the way Joseph claimed me, not as property to be controlled, but as something precious to be protected. The distinction mattered more than I could express. If I stay, if I let you handle this threat, what does that make me? I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing in my chest. Someone who hides behind your violence while you eliminate my problems? It makes you someone smart enough to accept protection when it's offered, he said firmly. Someone brave enough to choose safety over false independence. Someone who understands that sometimes the only way to stop a predator is with someone more dangerous. The logic was undeniable, but I couldn't shake the feeling that accepting his protection again would fundamentally change our relationship, would shift the balance between us in ways that couldn't be undone. I need to ask you something, I said, meeting his gaze steadily. And I need you to be completely honest. Always. If I choose to stay, if I let you eliminate this threat, will you still see me as someone worth protecting? Or will I become just another responsibility, another possession to be managed? The question hung between us, carrying the weight of every fear I'd harbored about powerful men and the women who depended on them. I watched Joseph's face carefully, looking for any sign of the patronizing dismissal I'd learned to recognize. Instead, I saw something that looked like admiration. Julia, the fact that you can ask that question, that you're still thinking independently even when you're afraid, is exactly why you're worth protecting. You're not asking me to think for you or make your choices. You're asking me to stand beside you while you face a threat that no one should have to face alone. The distinction was subtle but crucial, and I felt something inside me settle at his words. This wasn't about giving up my agency. It was about choosing to share the burden with someone strong enough to carry it. There's something else, I said, surprised by my own boldness. Something I need you to know before I make this decision. Tell me. I'm falling in love with you. The words came out quieter than I'd intended, but they carried absolute certainty. Not because you saved me, not because you're protecting me, but because of who you are when you think no one is watching. Because you bring me coffee in the mornings and remember that I like to read by the window in the afternoons. Because you listen when I talk about my mother and never make me feel guilty for wanting to visit her more often. I took a breath, gathering courage for the rest of it. If I stay, if I let you handle Victor, it won't be because I'm afraid to leave. It will be because I choose to build a life with you. Whatever that looks like. The effect of my confession was immediate and powerful. I watched Joseph's carefully controlled composure crack, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath. When he reached across the table to take my hands, his fingers were trembling slightly. "Julia," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been in love with you since the day you told me you were fine when I could see that you were breaking apart. I've been thinking about what it would mean to have you in my life, really in my life, not just as someone I'm protecting, but as someone I'm building a future with." The confession sent warmth flooding through me, washing away the last of my fears about his motives. When he stood and moved around the table to cup my face in his hands, I leaned into his touch without hesitation. "If you stay," he murmured, his thumbs tracing gentle paths across my cheekbones. "It won't just be about Victor. There will always be threats. Always be people who think they can use you to get to me. Are you prepared for that? Are you prepared to love someone who comes with her own complications?" I countered, thinking of my mother, my past, the lingering wounds that would take time to fully heal. "I'm prepared to love you exactly as you are," he said simply, complications and all. When he kissed me, it was nothing like the brutal possession I'd learned to expect from men who claimed to care. It was gentle, reverent, a promise made with lips and breath that spoke of partnership rather than ownership. When we broke apart, I knew that whatever choice I made would be mine alone, made with clear eyes and a full understanding of the consequences. "Then I stay," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I choose this life, this love, this future we can build together. The smile that spread across his face was radiant, transforming him from the dangerous man who could make people disappear into someone who looked almost young with happiness. And Victor? Victor learns why it was a mistake to threaten your family, I said, the word carrying new weight and meaning. Because that's what I am now, isn't it? Family. Yes, he said, pulling me into his arms with infinite tenderness. Your family, your home, your everything. As he held me against his chest, I could hear the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, feel the solid strength of his embrace, and for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be truly safe. Not just protected from external threats, but cherished for exactly who I was, valued for my strength, rather than controlled because of my vulnerabilities. The road ahead wouldn't be simple. Loving a man like Joseph meant accepting the shadows that came with his light. Understanding that our happiness would always be defended with methods that existed outside conventional morality. But as I stood in his arms, surrounded by luxury and safety and unconditional love, I knew that I had finally found where I belonged. I love you, I whispered against his chest and felt him tighten his arms around me. I love you too, he murmured into my hair. Always and completely. In the distance, the city glittered like a promise of future possibilities, but all that mattered was this moment, this choice, this man who had shown me that sometimes salvation came in unexpected forms. I had chosen love over fear, partnership over solitude, and for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be.